I've compared AMD's last 4 generations of 8-core Ryzen 7 processors to find out if it's time to upgrade or if you can save some money with an older model. All 4 of these Ryzen 7 processors are 8-core 16-thread chips, and the newer the CPU, the higher clock speeds they can reach. The newer ones generally have more cache, but something unique with the 7700X is it moves to the newer DDR5 memory for the first time in AMD's history. Ryzen 7000 chips also have integrated graphics now, something the older parts did not have. At the time of launching in September 2022, AMD plans to sell the 7700X for $400 US. Right now on Newegg, you can pick up the 5700X for $245, the 3700X for $181, and the 2700X for $169. Nice. These will change over time, so check current prices with the links below the video. With the high price tag on the 7700X, it begs the question, is AMD's 7700X worth paying more for compared to their older and cheaper CPUs? To find out, this is the system I've used to compare all 4 processors. I've tested with MSI's Core Liquid S360 AIO and Noctua NT-H2 thermal paste so we can fairly compare thermals, but the motherboard and RAM have been changed for the 7700X, as this uses the new AM5 socket and requires DDR5 memory. Alright, let's get straight into the application, thermals, and power draw tests, as these will be quite interesting. Then after that, we'll test out 11 games at 2 different resolutions. Let's start out with Cinebench R23, as it's an easy way to get a general idea of where single and multi-threaded performance are at. I've got the oldest 2700X down the bottom of the graph, going up to the newer CPUs with the 7700X at the top, and that new Zen 4-based 7700X is giving us the largest boost to performance that we've seen in many generations. Compared to the 5700X, which came out earlier this year, the newer 7700X is scoring 31% higher in single core and 45% higher in multi-core, while having the same core and thread count. Impressive stuff. We can see why the boost is so large when checking out the clock speeds being reached during this test. Before the 7700X, Ryzen chips would run all 8 cores around 4 GHz, but now Zen 4 is smashing beyond the 5 GHz barrier in a sustained manner. Again, impressive stuff, at least until we take a closer look under the hood. The 7700X is using more power than any other processor in order to reach these clock speeds. Yeah, it's scoring 45% higher compared to the 5700X just below it in Cinebench multi-core performance, but it's also using 66% more power to achieve this. Seems like AMD might have taken a page out of Intel's book. The 7700X ends up similar to the 3700X from an efficiency perspective, while the 5700X was the most efficient, at least in this specific test with no power limits. We could of course use eco mode on the 7700X to limit it to use less power, but we're testing at default here because I figured most people buying these CPUs will do the same. Given we can see power draw improving over time with AM4, I wonder if future AM5 CPUs will reduce power, or if AMD will continue pumping more juice in to show bigger gains. More power generally equals more heat, and the 7700X was reaching TJ max at 95 degrees Celsius in this test, even with my large 360 all-in-one liquid cooler. Now, AMD notes that with the new AM5 socket and higher TDP, 95 degrees Celsius is expected when under heavy multi-core load, and that this is intended and by design. They go on to note that TJ max is the maximum safe operating temperature, not the absolute max. The processor is designed to run at 95 degrees Celsius like this 24/7 without risk of damage or deterioration. So basically, AMD don't consider 95 degrees Celsius to be too hot, and Zen 4 will intentionally run at this temperature as much as it can in order to squeeze out as much performance as possible. Personally, I don't really see this as too much of an issue, but I'm used to testing laptops which always run at 95 degrees anyway. It sounds like you might need a good cooler in order to get the most from the 7700X. Alright, just before we get into the games, let's have a look at the rest of the application tests. Blender was tested with the Open Data Benchmark, and I've included all 3 different workloads that it tests. The 7700X had a massive 83% lead over the older 2700X in the classroom test, a 53% lead over the 3700X, and still a 48% lead over the 5700X, as the differences between the 3700X and 5700X weren't actually that big here, and this is something that we'll see more of as we go. The V-Ray benchmark is another heavy multi-threaded rendering workload, and the 7700X had some of its biggest gains here too, scoring 47% higher than the 5700X, 66% ahead of the 3700X before it, and 84% ahead of the 2700X before that. The Corona benchmark also uses the processor to render out a scene, but lower times are better in this one as we're looking at how long the task took rather than a score, and this workload had one of the smallest differences out of all applications tested. Linux kernel compilation was tested in Linux with Ubuntu 22.04, whereas the rest of the tests were all done with Windows 11. This is another example where the 3700X and 5700X weren't too different, which I suspect is due to them having the same amount of cache, as that's something that is known to affect compilation performance. Anyway, the 7700X was 32% faster than the 5700X. LLVM compilation is the only other test I've done in Linux, and again the 5700X and 3700X were much the same here. The 3700X was actually 10 seconds faster, which didn't really make sense to me, but I double-checked the result and got the same. The 7700X had a similar lead compared to the 5700X here too, at around 31% faster, though it's 50% faster compared to the 2700X, almost completing the test in half the time. Handbrake was used to convert my 4K 60fps review video of the Legion 7i gaming laptop to 1080p H.265. Lower times are better here, and again, the gap between the 3700X and 5700X is much smaller compared to the others. The 7700X was 28% faster than the 5700X and 43% faster than the 2700X. Adobe Premiere was tested with the Puget Systems benchmark tool, and this tests video editing tasks like exporting, playback, and more. Again, only minor differences between the 3700X and 5700X, with the 7700X having a larger lead. Don't forget the 7700X adds integrated graphics for the first time now, so this could in part be responsible for some of the performance uplift here, as Premiere can leverage integrated graphics. DaVinci Resolve is another video editing program, though the performance gap isn't as big here, with the 7700X scoring 21% better than the 5700X. One of the smallest differences out of all applications tested. CPUs definitely affect performance, but from my own testing, adding more GPU power usually increases this score more. Adobe Photoshop does better with more single-threaded performance, and as we saw in Cinebench earlier, the 7700X certainly has some nice gains there. It's scoring 34% ahead of the 5700X, but 82% ahead of the older 2700X. Now for some office tasks like Microsoft Excel, Word, PowerPoint, and Outlook. The 7700X was ahead in all workloads, so I guess consider upgrading if you're doing serious office business. 7-Zip was used to test compression and decompression. Ryzen generally does much better compared to Intel in these tests, and I really can't wait to compare Ryzen 7000 against Intel's 13th gen soon once those are available. Make sure you're subscribed for those comparisons. Anyway, the 7700X was 32% faster than the 5700X in compression and 25% in decompression. Compression is almost twice as fast on the 7700X when compared to the 2700X though, the biggest gain out of any workload tested. Geekbench tests a bunch of various workloads, some of which benefit from AVX 512 instructions, which is something that the 7700X has hardware support for and explains the above average gains. On average, out of all applications tested, the new 7700X is around 72% faster when compared to the older 2700X, though as we can see, there are significant differences between the various applications. For example, 7-zip compression was almost twice as fast on the 7700X. Compilation was around 50% faster. If we instead compare the 7700X against the 3700X, then we're looking at a 48% improvement with the newest 7700X in these specific application tests. There's a 32% improvement when compared against the the 5700X, which only launched earlier this year. So these are quite nice improvements compared to such a new product that's only a generation old. Alright, now let's get into some games. I've compared all 4 processors in 11 different games at both 1080p and 1440p resolutions. Let's start out with Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered. I've got the 1080p results below and 1440p results above, and again like before, with the older CPUs down the bottom moving to the newer ones above. This game didn't have that much of a performance difference between 1080p and 1440p resolutions. At 1080p, the 7700X is basically reaching twice the average frame rate compared to the 2700X. Awesome stuff. We're looking at a 56% lead with the 7700X when compared against the 3700X, and then a 31% higher average FPS compared to the newer 5700X. Microsoft Flight Simulator was tested in the Sydney Landing Challenge, and there weren't really any noteworthy differences between 1080p and 1440p in this game either. The gains aren't quite as big with the 7700X this time, which was around 15% faster compared to the 5700X at 1080p, though we're looking at a bigger 78% lead when compared against the older 2700X. The 2700X is absolutely still playable at close to 60 FPS high settings, but yeah, the 7700X is able to get us above 100 FPS. And like they always say, more frames, more better. Warhammer 3 was tested with the game's benchmark tool, and this time there's much less of a difference at the higher 1440p resolution. The CPU choice hardly matters at all here, implying we're starting to become GPU bottlenecked by the RTX 3090 Ti. Luckily, 40 series is just around the corner. Get subscribed for my upcoming comparisons with it. The gaps are a bit bigger at 1080p, but we're looking at a below average result when compared with the other 10 games tested. Halo Infinite has some bigger gaps at 1440p, though the differences between the 5700X and 7700X at 1440p were just an 8% lead with the 7700X. Not much of a difference, though there's a much larger 59% boost with the 7700X when compared with the 2700X. The gaps are larger at 1080p, as we're generally less GPU bound at lower resolutions. The 7700X was 88% ahead of the 2700X here, 57% ahead of the 3700X, and 32% ahead of the 5700X. Things start looking a little weird in Call of Duty Warzone. At 1080p, we're seeing basically the same average FPS on the 3700X, 5700X, and 7700X, though the dips in performance, as shown by the 1% lows, were notably higher with the newer 7700X, so a little smoother experience. The 5700X appears to be ahead at 1440p, though it's only by a few frames. I put the 5700X back in after testing all 4 CPUs to check this, but got the same results. So not sure what the deal is. Granted, a 3 to 5 FPS difference isn't one anyone's actually going to notice when playing, so I'd say we're seeing a margin of error difference here. Speaking of weird results, something similar was seen in Apex Legends, and yes, I've got the frame cap removed. The 5700X was technically ahead at 1080p, while the 3700X was basically tied with the 7700X at 1440p in terms of average FPS. The 2700X isn't too far behind here either, so basically at max settings, it doesn't really seem to matter too much which CPU you're going with. I considered testing with lower setting levels to avoid a GPU bottleneck, but there wasn't much choice as the game still caps FPS to 300 even if you turn off the lower cap. Fortnite didn't have any such issues, though I was able to test with medium settings here as it's not limited to 300 FPS like Apex. The 7700X was just 14% ahead of the 5700X at the lower 1080p resolution, while the 1% lows were basically the same. The 7700X was 63% faster than the older 3700X, and then a whopping 104% faster compared to the 2700X, meaning the 7700X is more than doubling its frame rate. While we're on the subject of esports games, CSGO was also seeing massive boosts with the newer processors. The 7700X was reaching a 136% higher average frame rate compared to the 2700X here. So yeah, if you're playing games competitively that rely on CPU power like these, an upgrade upgrade could be well worth it. If you've got a 2700X, upgrading to the 5700X and getting a 93% gain would be a much easier and cheaper solution, considering all you'd have to do is a drop-in replacement of the CPU. Cyberpunk 2077 was another where we started seeing GPU limits at 1440p, at least with the high setting preset. The 3700X, 5700X, and 7700X were all reaching basically the same average frame rate, though the 1% lows with the 3700X were lower, and the 2700X was only like 10 FPS behind. There's a bit more of a difference at the lower 1080p resolution where we're more CPU bound. The 2700X was able to get us 100 FPS when paired with the 3090 Ti, but the 7700X was 48% faster, which is actually a below average difference out of the 11 titles that I've tested. I've tested the Rift Breaker using the CPU benchmark option, and the 7700X had quite a lead here. The gap between the 2700X and 3700X wasn't that big comparatively, with the 3700X just 16% faster at 1080p. The 5700X was 30% faster than the 3700X just below it, while the 7700X was 36% ahead of the 5700X. Like a number of other CPU-heavy games tested, there's no major difference whether or not we're running at 1080p or 1440p. Last game before we get into the fun comparison graphs. Watch Dogs Legion was tested with the game's benchmark, and more often than not, this game was right in line with the overall 11-game average. On average, over all 11 games tested, at 1080p, the new 7700X was performing 72% better than the older 2700X. As we can see here, the differences really depend on the specific game. CSGO at the top, for example, is 135% faster with the 7700X, while Apex Legends down the bottom was only 4% faster on the 7700X. If we step up to the higher 1440p resolution, then the 7700X is instead 58% faster compared to the 2700X. Most games lose some performance at higher resolutions as there's simply more pixels to render, but although this is generally more GPU bound, we're still seeing some big gains with the 7700X. Though at the same time, other games only saw small gains. If we instead compare the 3700X with the 7700X, the 7700X was 43% faster on average in our 11 games tested at 1080p. Call of Duty Warzone and Apex Legends had basically no differences, at least with all settings maxed out. Perhaps that would have been different at lower settings. Again, at 1440p, like we also saw when comparing the 2700X and 7700X, some of the games had basically no change. If you're all about playing Cyberpunk at 1440p high settings, for instance, then there's no real point in a CPU upgrade from the 3700X. The 7700X was just 16% faster compared to the 5700X at 1080p. I mean, the 5700X did only come out earlier this year, and while some games had decent improvements, the 11-game average isn't that amazing, at least when compared to some of the massive performance gains that we saw earlier outside of gaming. Once more, there's less of a difference at the higher 1440p resolution, with the 7700X performing 12% faster compared to the 5700X on average in the same 11 games. Here's what we're looking at when we take the average frame rates from all 11 games tested to try and identify some overall trends. After seeing that the 1440p data isn't all that much lower than 1080p, I kind of regret not testing 4K as well. Despite the 7700X offering the best raw gaming performance, it's not the best value option due to its higher cost. AMD are launching it for $400 US, so it's going to be hard for it to compete against the 5700X when you can pick that up for $150 less. And this is only factoring in CPU costs, not motherboards or DDR5 memory. The prices I've got for the older CPUs are the lowest at Newegg when I'm making this video in late September. But again, use the links below the video to check current prices. The 3700X is technically the best in terms of dollar per multi-core performance in a workload like Cinebench 2, as it's simply less than half the price of the 7700X. The 7700X is of course scoring 57% higher in the Cinebench multi-core test, but you've got to pay more than twice the amount to get that extra performance. And let's not forget, if you do have a 2700X, you can do a drop-in replacement to either the 3700X or 5700X without changing hardware. In fact, you can go right up to the 16-core 5950X. Honestly, Honestly, based on this, if you already have an AM4 system, upgrading to the 5700X gives you most of the gains for way less of the price. Not only is the 5700X CPU alone more than $150 cheaper, but the 7700X would mean you've also got to shell out for a new motherboard and DDR5 memory. To be fair, the prices of DDR5 memory have come down a bit since last year. It's not quite as much of a ripoff as it was before. Plus, if you were upgrading to AM5, you could always sell your old stuff to get some of the cost back. Now, although the 3700X is the best value in both gaming and productivity, there's no denying that the 7700X offers some nice performance improvements. Ultimately, it comes down to whether or not you want to spend the extra money for the performance improvements that I've shown in this video. I've also done this same comparison, but with the Ryzen 9 3950X, 5950X, and 7950X 16-core processors. So come and check out that comparison over here next. The conclusion's actually a bit different to this one. Now, AMD is by no means the only CPU maker around. Intel's 13th gen processors will be here very soon, so make sure you're subscribed for my upcoming comparisons with those.